For decades, pretty much every business has run on one big idea about how employees perform. It's an idea that shapes who gets hired, who gets promoted, basically how success is measured. But what if that core belief is just plain wrong? What if it's costing companies an absolute fortune by making them blind to their best people? The financial implications here are staggering, so let's dive right in. So here's the deal. Most companies, probably even yours, operate on this myth of the bell curve. The idea that most of us are clumped in the middle is average. But when you actually look at the data from over 800,000 workers, the reality is something totally different. Performance isn't a bell curve. It's what's called a heavy-tailed distribution. A very small group of star performers creates this massive long tail of incredible output. And understanding this difference, it isn't just for academics, it's the key to unlocking some serious value. All right, so here's our game plan for this explainer. We're going to expose the bell curve lie, and then we'll define what a star actually is. We'll figure out how to calculate their true worth, then we'll get into a cool twist called the law of diminishing stars, see when they matter most, and then wrap it all up with a brand new talent playbook you can actually use. All right, first up, the bell curve lie. Let's dig into why this one assumption has been holding businesses back for so long. And look, this isn't some dusty old theory. It's literally baked into the DNA of most HR departments. The tools companies use to measure the financial return on things like hiring or training, they're all built for a bell curve world. By their very design, they treat these amazing star performers as statistical noise, just outliers you can ignore. The result? A system that's completely blind to its most valuable assets. Okay, so if we're throwing out the bell curve, what do we replace it with? Well, that brings us to the hero of our story, the star performer. Now, when we say star, we're not just talking about someone who's, pretty good at their job. The research defines them as people who produce a disproportionately huge amount of output. We're not talking 20% better. We're talking about a level of contribution so far above average, it completely shatters the old scale. And you might be thinking, okay, that's just for tech gurus or Wall Street sharks, right? Nope. The data shows this pattern absolutely everywhere. From lawyers measured by the revenue they bring in, to programmers by lines of code, even to agricultural workers by how much fruit they pick. The star performer pattern is a universal truth across a huge range of jobs. So this all leads to the big question, the multi-million-dollar question, really. If our old ways of measuring are blind to stars, how do we calculate what they're actually worth? This is where things get really interesting. To figure this out, the researchers used 6 different methods to measure talent's financial value. Think of it like this. It's like adjusting the focus on a camera. The old school models, they're the blurriest view. They almost completely ignore stars. But as you move down the list, the focus gets sharper and sharper until you get to number 6, the observed distribution. That's the crystal clear 4K view that captures the real-world impact of everyone, especially those high-impact stars. So what happens when you switch from that blurry, old-school lens to the crystal-clear 4K view? What's the actual difference in value? Is it, 10%? 50%? Not even close. It's a mind-blowing 9.08 times greater. Let's put that into perspective. Look at this. Using the old, blurry models, you might think a great hiring program gives you a one-time return. But the true value, the value you're leaving on the table, is over 9 times higher. It's like you're running your entire talent strategy on a map that's missing 90% of the treasure. Okay, so the answer seems obvious, right? Just go out and hire all the superstars. Well, not so fast. The data has a really fascinating and honestly counterintuitive twist for us. It's the logical question to ask. Should every single company just pour all its resources into a top 1% or bust strategy? Well, it turns out the answer is a lot more subtle than that. What this table shows us is something economists have known for a long time, the law of diminishing returns. Look at the added value you get as you chase a more and more elite group. Shifting to include the top 15% of performers gives you a massive 2.76 times gain. But the jump from there to the top 3% adds less, and the final push for that absolute top 1% adds even less than that. The extra gains start shrinking. This is that classic pattern in action. The biggest financial leap, the real game changer, doesn't come from getting into a bidding war over the single best person in the world. It comes from making that first, huge strategic shift away from an average-focused model to one that correctly values that whole top tier of performers. Okay, so if chasing that absolute number 1 spot isn't always the best move, how do you know when it is worth it? Well, it all comes down to context, the context of the job and your industry. First, let's talk about time. Over a whole career, a star performer can create a truly massive gap in output, which means it really, really pays to go after the very best. But for, say, a short-term project, that gap is much smaller. The difference between the number 1 and number 10 performer just isn't as big of a deal financially. And it's the exact same idea when you look at performance ceilings. In a job with a high ceiling, like sales or research and development, a star has basically unlimited room to shine. But in a role that's capped, maybe by the speed of a machine on an assembly line, the difference between the top performers is tiny. Overinvesting to get the absolute best there just doesn't make financial sense. All right, let's pull all of this together. How do you actually use this information? How do you shift your organization to a modern, star-centric strategy? What's the new playbook? The new playbook really boils down to 4 key things. First, stop assuming average. Just accept that performance is a power law, and then use valuation models that can actually see your stars. Next, understand diminishing returns. Remember, the biggest win is shifting from average to good, not always from great to greatest. And finally, let context be your king. The value of chasing those top-tier stars completely depends on the timeframes and performance ceilings that define your work. And that leaves us with one final, and I think really critical question for you and your company. In this intense race for talent, are you spending all of your resources hunting for a single mythical unicorn, or are you strategically building an entire stable of thoroughbreds? Because the answer could be worth millions.